What makes a perfect watch casting? How do you perfectly cast a watch in a film? What does it mean? What makes watches such brilliant props? Very much like the costumes, the makeup, the characters themselves, we know that watches can very much represent extensions of the character. They're very much extensions of us, and we see that on rare occasions. Sometimes the watches perfectly reflect the character. And maybe what allows for these watches to be represented so well, it's because of the specialists behind the scenes. Now, as enthusiasts, we enjoy seeing these nuances. We very much know what the watches are. We might even find that we watch these films predominantly because of the watches featured in them. Call it a sickness, it probably is. And maybe we don't register just how well the watch works for the character, but our brains do. So these are a few films that have impacted my thinking on the subject, and of course there are many, many more. In this talk we're going to be focusing on movies and not series, so The Sopranos, Mad Men won't be featured. And instead of focusing on just every watch in every film, try to find a series of pieces that capture how the watch represents the character the best. Some do it better than others, as you will see, but the franchise that was the catalyst around this idea was the most recent Batman series, directed by Christopher Nolan. Bruce Wayne, played by Christian Bale, wears a Jaeger-LeCoultre Reverso throughout the trilogy. Every single film in the trilogy he's wearing the same watch, and it is such excellent casting. It is probably one of the best on this list, for obvious reasons, if you know what the watch does. In the Batman franchise, we see that characters always have this duality to them. Whether hero or villain, they all have alter egos. And a lot of the time, the way they represent themselves is better shown through their superheroes, not so much their everyday selves. In the case of Bruce Wayne, wearing a JLC Reverso, a watch that has two faces that you can, in fact, rotate, it's very symbolic in a way. Of course, the only time you see this watch in the series is when he is Bruce Wayne. And that raises the question, would the watch have been better represented on screen if it remained reversed, where the face was actually hidden? Because as many of us know, Bruce Wayne is very much the mask, and Batman is his true representation. It's a fascinating thing when you think about it, and the watch extends this portrayal of his character so well. It's subtle, and the average moviegoer wouldn't know the difference. So in this case, for this franchise, I think we can all agree that Nolan knows his watches. We have seen other pieces that have been used in a very period-correct fashion for his other films. But as far as a watch representing a character like Batman, the Reverso is something very special. And then you have to ask, what about the character of Two-Face? Wouldn't the Reverso suit him even more? When speaking about watches that represent their time period so well, not much comes close to the Seiko 6105 used in Apocalypse Now by Captain Willard. The watch doesn't represent the character very well, but it is a piece that is time accurate, period correct, very much a watch that you would expect to see. And as we know, this piece stepped into the limelight at this point and pushed the Seiko diver name to stardom. But a much more interesting character-related piece, which was obviously done by accident, that is a much more accurate portrayal of the character that wears it, is the Rolex GMT 1675, worn by Marlon Brando as Colonel Kurtz. I've made a video about this piece which will be linked in the corner, which actually looks at his character study in a lot more detail, breaking down just how this watch represents him. Essentially, it's a piece that, without a bezel, indicates that as a character, Colonel Kurtz has lost one of the retaining features to his personality. This was all done by accident, of course. There was no true purpose behind removing the bezel from the watch other than to make it unrecognizable at the time. But it is a piece that gives you a bit more of a fascinating insight into Kurtz's mind, how it is essentially open. The retainer that keeps it closed has been removed. Then, next, we're looking at James Bond and the evolution of the watch that he wears. In the beginning, Sean Connery wearing a 6538 Big Crown Submariner. This was a very historic moment for this watch, which has since pushed it into the limelight, and it now is a pop culture icon. Many of us also agree that the Rolex 1016 was probably a more accurate representation of the watch that Fleming wanted for the character. But the Submariner does a few more things. It's a much more functional looking instrument, bare bones, lacking any kind of intricacies. It's functional but also perfect for formal occasions. And then we transition through the ages until we arrive at the modern era of James Bond, wearing a Omega Seamaster. In another video that I will link in the corner, all about these characters and which watch suits the purpose better as a companion for James Bond, I mentioned that as these brands have evolved over time, they have gone in different directions. And the Seamaster very much picked up where the Submariner left off. Both the watches, during their separate times, represent this sports-oriented, ready-for-action appearance. Some are simpler than others, some are more complicated. But we see throughout the years that most of these watches become more and more integral and important for the character himself. They are functional, they are used as gadgets, and add just a little bit more nuance to the mystique that is James Bond as a character. Moving then to the Wolf of Wall Street, Jordan Belfort wearing a Tag Heuer Professional 1000. On first glance, you believe it to be a Rolex Submariner in solid gold, but it definitely isn't. And what I find fascinating about this watch representing the character next to his partner, who wears a solid gold Rolex Daytona, you think to yourself, why would he choose this piece over a Rolex, for example? The answer might be because he doesn't see himself worthy enough to wear the watch. Or that even through this experience of procuring fancy clothes, houses, cars, he still doesn't have the knowledge in this area. You could say there's almost a level of tackiness to this piece, how it represents itself as this almost blatant replica of a Rolex Submariner. And maybe this was the approach that the filmmakers wanted to bring forward, a watch that's a look-alike but isn't genuine to the original. Very much like the character who lies, cheats and steals his way to the top. Then transitioning to the polar opposite in a way. In American Psycho we see that Patrick Bateman wears a Rolex 16013 two-tone Datejust with a tapisserie dial. It's much more in line with that era. Very much represents the 1980s and the typical character that Bateman plays. You don't even need to think twice about what watch he wears because it's almost stereotypical. We could even say that he chooses this watch because he is trying to fit in with what everyone else does. And isn't that actually so correct with his character? The way that he tries to be normal. Meanwhile, he's a complete nutcase. There's a fascinating divide between the two watches we've just looked at that represent the time period, but the characters are what sell them. We move to Michael Delaney in the film Le Mans. Actor Steve McQueen wearing a Heuer Monaco caliber 11. We know that at the time the Heuer Ortavia was the watch of choice by the racing drivers for the Golf Porsche team. What this watch did so well as the statement, it stood out on his wrist. Because of its form factor and its color, it represents not only the 70s, but also just looks the part. Does it actually represent the character? Not so much, not in this case. But the film and the piece's portrayal pushed this watch sky high. And we could say that as a watch of the 70s, it is so characteristic and representative of the time, which is a common theme that we will see more occurrences of later on in the video. Marathon Man, starring Dustin Hoffman as Thomas Levy, wearing a Rolex 1675 GMT again. Now in the film, this watch is gifted to him by his brother, who very much is a, we could say, international man of mystery. He travels a lot. We could then say that he intended for Thomas to use the watch for its purpose, being something that he could use to track a different time zone. In a way, we could think that this watch was used to tie Levy with his brother, knowing the time zone where his brother was, so they could synchronize phone calls. It's a watch that also is very much out of place, as Levy does point out that he could never afford the watch himself, and that it could pay for his entire school tuition. And then the iconic scene, which kind of runs at full circle, is that he gives the watch to a taxi driver in order to get some change to make a phone call. It's a fascinating watch, especially when we consider the complication and what his brother maybe intended him to use it for. There is a bit of mystique behind it. Now in the movie The Deep, starring Nick Nolte, he wears a typical Rolex Submariner of the time. And we know that throughout this film, David Saunders very much spends most of his time in the ocean. The film is oriented around diving. So as it is, capturing that timeline, it's a watch that very much is fit for purpose. Does it represent his character much? Not really. And we've seen this in many other movies of the time as well, like Steve McQueen in The Hunter, and Redford in All the President's Men. But instead of looking at Redford wearing a 1680 Submariner, the actual film that represents his character so much more with the watch that he chooses is All Is Lost, a fairly recent film where he chooses a Seiko SKX 009. You can tell that in this movie he is the one who possibly chose the watch. He's clearly an enthusiast. And as a character, he doesn't even have a name. He is just known as a man, sailing on a humble yacht, and after being struck by a shipping container, he has to brave the elements in a life raft. Not only does the SKX represent this near to final evolution of the Willard that we saw in the very beginning. But at this point in time, the watch is so accessible. And you think to yourself that as a character, he picked up this watch because it is accessible, because it's easy to understand and use. He doesn't necessarily care about watches, he just wants something that works. And that's also clearly evident by the way he decides to wear it on a NATO strap. Maybe I'm looking too deep into this, but he possibly wore a similar Seiko during the Vietnam War. Considering his age, this could very much line up with his character and his past. It's a functional instrument that has complications like a day date, a rotating bezel, ISO certification, a great level of water resistance. It's a practical tool. And we should also add that as a character, he is very knowledgeable of all of these pieces of equipment. So he clearly knows what he's doing. It's a great piece that we could say represents things like humbleness and many other good traits, as well as the fact that it represents his character so well. Then we note Glengarry Glen Ross when Blake comes into the room and condescends, instructs, in a way inspires the men sitting behind their desks. He's wearing a solid gold Rolex day date, a piece that at the time again represents that status and wealth, very much linked to his character. But interestingly, next to the watches that we've already seen from this time period, like the two-tone Datejust, this piece worn by this character does a great job at representing the character he's trying to portray, as well as making him sound like an arrogant bully. He knows it's a Rolex, he knows its worth, but he doesn't know what the watch is really. He uses it as an example to show off his wealth. Nothing more, and he uses it to make that statement. Transitioning to Aliens and the Ripley Seiko reference 7A287000, designed by the legend Giugiaro, who created incredible icons of the 70s. This watch doesn't represent the character so much as it represents the futuristic retro style that is used with all of the equipment in the franchise. It looks like a lot more than just a watch, and that's clearly how it was represented. You think that the watch does something a lot more than just tell the time and run a chronograph. But as a piece that captures that 70s transition into the 80s, this one does such a good job. This is a very easy casting, but the Omega Speedmaster Professional used in Apollo 13. It's one of the most pivotal pieces of equipment that saves the mission. And the fact that that was included in the film makes it all the more precious, interesting, engaging, sparked the inspiration for a lot of enthusiasts. That's really what it's all about at the end of the day. The role of the Speedmaster in the film was paramount and was executed perfectly, if not a bit over-dramatized. Over the course of this franchise, we've seen Tony Stark wearing a series of extremely complicated pieces. One of the most notable times is in Iron Man 2, when he asks to be passed the Jaeger, a Jaeger-LeCoultre Omnivox Aston Martin. Now this watch, along with many others that he wears like an Uhrwerk, they all have the same status of being engineering marvels. The way the complications are arranged are so different. The pieces celebrate traditional watchmaking, but at the same time push the technology further and further. And it so accurately represents the mind of Tony Stark, the way he portrays himself and his work. All of the watches that you're currently seeing have this X factor to them. There are actually too many watches to discuss under his name, but the ones that you are seeing are the watches that he wears during the franchise. Pieces that all manage to push the technological boundaries while also appreciating the traditional art of watchmaking and manufacturing. And then to cap off this list, Thomas Crown, played by Steve McQueen in the Thomas Crown Affair, wearing a Cartier Curvex Tank Cintre. If you ever needed a watch that screams sophistication, elegance, subtlety, this is a great example. It represents the time period where it is shown. It works so easily with the suits that he decides to wear. And as a character, the piece also manages to portray him. We could use words like sly, stretched even, crooked. As you've seen through this presentation, some watches really have managed to make a mark. Not only because they capture the character so well, as an extension of them, but also because in a lot of situations they are relevant to their time period. What all of them manage to do, some better than most, is add an extra level of depth to the characters that they represent. And that is perfect watch casting.